Hi, everyone. This is Rob Doggett from the International Yeats Society and the State University of New York at Geneseo. And I'm here to talk today with David Holdeman. David's a professor of English at the University of North Texas. Good to see you, David.
Thank you for having me, Rob.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure. And I'm going to mention, I'll ask in a second what you're currently working on. I know you've been in admin for a little while, so you're just coming out of it. But I do want to mention some things that some of your works, in particular, the Cambridge Introduction to Yeats, which I found really invaluable. It's one of the books that I assign to my students whenever I teach Yeats. And I take students over to Sligo to the Yeats Summer School, and that's the book I always have. It's really accessible. The students find it really, a good intro to the time period, to the different stages in Yeats's career, to the biographical information. So it's a great book, and I definitely recommend it to people watching this video. So what are you currently working on?
Well, I've just finished up an essay on symbolic book design in the later Yeats, which I wrote for a collection on W.B. Yeats and the arts that's coming out from Edinburgh, and it's edited by Charles Armstrong, Tom Walker, and Adrian Patterson. So I'm finished with that, or at least until they asked me to revise it a little bit. And now I'm, as you know, putting together a special issue of the Journal of International Yeats Studies on the topic of Yeats and materiality, and we're doing this to honor George Bornstein, who was my teacher at Michigan years ago, and of course had a lot to do with getting the conversation about the material text of Yeats's work started and advancing that conversation. So I'm really looking forward to working on that essay. I'm going to try to contribute an essay of my own to the collection. That's pretty early stages of development, but I'm interested in material artifacts in Yeats's poetry, by which I would define a material artifact as an object manufactured by a human being. Mm-hmm. And there are surprisingly few of those. There's some very famous ones, but there are surprisingly few, and I just want to kind of explore that a little bit. So that's what I'm working on tonight.
And that's going to be, we've been talking about that over the last couple of weeks. That volume is going to be fantastic, I think. So I'm really looking forward to that coming out. So you chose The Cold Heaven, and that's a poem that whenever I look it up, I always end up going to the wrong volume. I often think it's in Michael Robarts or in The Wild Swans. I forget that it's in Responsibilities. It's sort of because of its sort of afterlife ideas that I was thinking, oh, well, that must be after Yeats was kind of working a little bit more on that with the automatic writing, but it's in Responsibility, so a little bit earlier, sort of early middle part of Yeats's career. So why'd you choose this one?
Well, I guess I think maybe it's a little underrated or underappreciated or underdiscussed in comparison to some of the most famous Yeats poems. I wanted to show it a little love. Mm-hmm. It's a poem that I fell in love with because I had to transcribe the manuscripts of the poem for my edition of the Cornell Yeats. Mm. As you pointed out, the poem ended up in Responsibilities, but it was actually its first publication in a Yeats volume was in the 1912 American edition of The Green Helmet and Other Poems. So it wound up being in my Cornell Yeats edition in the Seven Woods and The Green Helmet. And it's really a terrific set of manuscripts. You get 7 pages of very rough drafts. There's this, reading it, you get this sense of sort of frenzied, excited composition. There's something really personal and maybe even confessional about the process of the poem's creation. It's got a lot of stuff in it the manuscripts have a lot of stuff that didn't make it into the finished poem. You know, describes himself sitting idly in a railway carriage, mm-hmm. Looking out the window, lying on the cushion half asleep, counting the stations. And by the end of and then the image of the ice burning and so forth comes in, and by the end of the first page, he's talking about his soul in torment. Mm-hmm. So it just has this really personal feel to it. And And then finally, I've just found that it's a poem that teaches really well. It's brief. Students don't bring the same prior knowledge of, sometimes you try to teach the second coming, they've already heard a bunch of stuff about it,
Mhm.
and that gets in the way. So it's a great short poem to teach. I'm not surprised that you think of it as being a later poem, because I think it really offers an accessible introduction to some ideas that are really key in the later Yeats, specifically the question of the agency or lack thereof involved in visionary seeing,
Mhm.
and then also the nature of judgment, of divine judgment, or of humanity's capacity to judge itself.
Mm. That's interesting. And I think what you're talking about, the manuscripts, I do remember someone lecturing on that poem and saying he was in England and was in a journey, and he'd just seen, I think, a performance of Deirdre, was on the way to see a performance of the Countess Kathleen. Really interesting. And that all of that gone, you don't think of railways when you think of that poem. But let me share my screen so you can read it. And oh boy, I am not doing my best with screen sharing today. There we go. All right. Can you see it?
I can.
Okay, great.
Suddenly, I saw the cold and rook-delighting heaven that seemed as though ice burned and was but the more ice. And thereupon imagination and heart were driven so wild that every casual thought of that and this vanished, and left but memories that should be out of season with the hot blood of youth, of love crossed long ago. And I took all the blame out of all sense and reason until I cried and trembled and rocked to and fro, riddled with light. Ah, when the ghost begins to quicken, confusion of the deathbed over, is it sent out naked on the roads, as the books say, and stricken by the injustice of the skies for punishment?
Thanks, David. That's really I hadn't read it in a while, and I read it last night again. As I said, after looking in the wrong volumes, and I thought, what a really remarkable poem, and striking that imagery. Now I know you're saying it's accessible for students. It doesn't have an especially complicated form, but maybe talk a little bit about the sort of poem overall, and then we can go through a little bit sort of line by line.
Well, I think one of the things that's most interesting about the poem is it's got this. There's an interplay of formal elements in the poem that creates an amazing sense of verbal and visionary energy that is surging through or over barriers.
Mm.
It's kind of, in my mind, it's like the linguistic equivalent of a powerful river that is running up against and through the rocks of a rapids and sort of turning into white water.
Mm.
And the current of the river is the syntax, because the syntax of this poem is just powerfully driving forward. You can notice that 4 out of the first 5 lines are in jammed.
Mm-hmm.
There's very little punctuation until you get to the last 4 lines. There's just this sense of sudden, quick moving sight and thought and speech. But all of that energy has to make its way through a lot of pattern. The poem has a very interestingly patterned rhyme scheme, for example. I would describe it as kind of a rhyming tour de force. It's the scheme itself is relatively simple. It's just A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F. But if you notice the rhymes for all the odd numbered lines, 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, and 11, those are all 2-syllable words. And they all end in either en or on. So it's almost just to repeat, it's heaven driven, season, reason, quicken, stricken. So there's a sense almost as though the A rhyme is being carried all the way through the poem, since those rhymes are so similar. So that's just, to me, it's just amazing that he can embed that kind of artfulness in the midst of this spontaneous onrush of language.
That's
And
amazing, David. I think you're right. And that is with Yeats, it's the kind of thing I often need pointed out to me, the kind of complexities beneath that simplicity. I love that. I hadn't seen that. And I love that idea of the A rhyme being carried over. I mean, one of the things I did notice in the poem, of course, is as you're reading it, is a lot of that enjambment and that sense of being pushed forward. But I sort of looked at it, it was like, oh, okay, we got the A, B. But you're right, that little bit of that echo of the A running throughout, that kind of structure, really, really fascinating.
he tones it back a little bit with some slant rhyme. You get rhymes like ice and this. He tones it back a little bit by pairing 1 and 2 syllable words, or one syllable words with multisyllabic words like scent and punishment. But still, it's a really well rhymed poem. And the meter, the rhythm and the meter are similarly patterned. This is a very hard poem to scan. I won't walk you through a scansion of it because it's difficult. But one of the things that I think probably most readers would agree on is that there are 6 strong stresses in each line, and a basically iambic beat. So it's basically an iambic hexameter. But if you notice, the even number of the even lines, each one of the even numbered lines has exactly 12 syllables. But all of the odd numbered lines have between 13 to 15 syllables. So you get in those even numbered lines with the 12 syllables, you get a much more consistently iambic feel. And I just kind of find it interesting that he varies from that, but he varies from it in a patterned way. Every other line is a little bit less regular than the one that came before it. So it again, it's just kind of, there's this looseness and spontaneity, but there's underneath it, there's a lot of pattern, there's a lot of artifice. And I really don't, there's really no other English language poet that does this balancing between the jaggedness of speech and the formal patterning, as well as Yeats. And it's all highly relevant to the poem's content because, part of what the poem is making us want to question is the speaker of this poem a passive recipient of sudden vision that flows in on him from without, or is he the active maker of patterns that channel vision? And so the form itself is kind of echoing that thematic tension. I just think it's marvelous.
I think that's so interesting. And as I was reading it yesterday and this morning, I was doing a little scanning on it, and I was sort of like, okay, we've got this kind of loose iambic going on, but I did not attend to that the even odd number. And I think that's right. It has that loose, that sense of flow about it. And then there's the kind of structure. That's so typical of Yeats too. You don't even see it until you really start unpacking it and seeing how much artifice is built into it. So yeah, that's great. So maybe we can kind of go through then from the sort of the start here, the big suddenly.
Yeah, well, suddenly is a great way to begin the poem, isn't it? Because it's the whole poem is about suddenness. The word suddenly is this dactylic word that starts with a strong stress and then trails away. So it's kind of enacting its own jarring, abrupt meaning in terms of its rhythm. And then, right after suddenly you get I saw, which is, you get a noun and a verb, and it's in the active voice, and it's asserting agency. But if you see something suddenly, how much of an agent are you really? So even in the first 3 words, you get this kind of microcosm of the tension of the whole poem, I'm a seer. I see, I do that actively, but something sudden is happening here. And it's almost like a contest between the thing that's flowing in on me and my ability to shape and process that. Yeah, and right away, the quality of this vision gets interesting right away. I noticed that, for example, coldness is not something that the human eye can see.
Yeah.
Neither is delight. So right away, this vision is kind of claiming extra visual powers for itself.
Mhm.
Coldness is, of course, important because it's not just the coldness of the air temperature, but the potential indifference or injustice of the skies we're already being prepared for to think about. We get this, when I teach the poem, I find my students really love this phrase, rook delighting, because it's kind of a surprise, they don't know what rooks are. How could the sky be rook delighting? It's fun to talk about that.
Mm-hmm.
Rooks are blackbirds. They have a hoarse cry. They are almost indistinguishable from crows and ravens.
Mm-hmm.
So the speaker of this poem clearly has sharp vision. Even if you can distinguish a rook from the other very similar kinds of birds that might be out there, that's a kind of visionary power. All of these birds too, have connotations in Irish folklore. They're associated with the Morrigu, with the sort of ominous supernatural bird that works its powers in the Toyne and perches on Cuchullin's shoulder at the moment of his death. So there's a sense of the supernatural at work here, of something ominous. And there's a sense that I think, that any heaven that would delight rooks would not necessarily be particularly hospitable to human beings.
And that, picking up on that juxtaposition of cold, of course, right? Immediately, yeah. That sense that the sort of cold and heaven there. I think too that as you're talking about the idea of vision here, this play between what's objective and subjective in this, and that ties in with what you're talking about with vision. Like, is this a vision it's imposed upon him, or is this a vision that he is in control, the speaker's in control of? And then we get that sort of seeming, and again, another sort of paradox here of ice burning.
Yeah, the ice burning, but this is one of the first lines in the manuscripts that really kind of coalesced as a finished line. So this is really kind of in some ways, the germ of the poem. On one level, it's possible to read it as just natural description. It's cold, the sun is setting. In the manuscripts, the setting sun is gleaming on water, and so there's reflection and so forth. So you can kind of imagine a wintry sky that has this cold, icy feel to it. But there's also this paradox. The paradox isn't just that ice is burning, but that it somehow, as a result of this burning, seems more like ice. It's becoming more of its own essence. Mm-hmm. So it makes you wonder, is this is a heaven in which some kind of refinement is occurring, some kind of purgatorial something is happening, something that is simultaneously miraculous, beautiful, truth revealing, maybe also painful.
Mm. We think about all of the sort of different ways Yeats thinks about the afterlife in his visionary system, and the commonality of refinement, of the kind of purifying in all of these different phases, the dreaming back, for example. And again, it's sort of, this is before he's elaborated any of that. So we get these, it's hard not to see this as a kind of precursor to the notions that he develops later on.
I definitely see it that way.
Yeah. And then the next line, then, and thereupon, and this one, the weird echo you get later in among school children of this line, right? It's hard to read this line without thinking, oh, he's kind of working towards among school children. And thereupon, imagination and heart were driven so wild. Um, so, yeah, what do you, so the speaker then, this ice kind of purifying, becoming its more essence, and then this sparks imagination and heart into this kind of revelry.
Well, I think what's gonna happen in the next few lines is that the ice burning and being more like ice, that the what's going on in the heaven is going to have a corollary in what's going on within the speaker, but it's not going to be exactly the same. It's going to be kind of a strange mirror image of what's going on in the heaven, but it starts here. I find it interesting to me that just to kind of walk through the sequence of a process that's going on here, that starts with sight and then triggers or stimulates imagination, which then stimulates heart or emotion, and that causes thought to vanish. And wildness is the result of all of this. It's really quite interesting. I usually think of imagination as an originating human capacity. Things start with imagination, but here the imagination is definitely a receptive quality, right? The sight comes in, triggers imagination. Imagination does something to heart, emotion, and that causes casual thought, at any rate, to disappear, and what's left is wildness. So something like the refining process that's going on in the sky, in the heaven, is also happening in the speaker, and it's the result of it is wildness. A word that suggests passion, but also a lack of restraint. Definitely at this point in the poem, it seems as though the speaker is a passive recipient of vision more than an active initiator or controller of vision. I think that balance may shift a little bit by the end of the poem, but at this moment it seems like, wow, this is happening to me. I'm being driven into something.
Is this parallel, or is this a function in some way then of, or even a description of memory, the way that we can be overwhelmed by a memory that comes out upon us suddenly?
Maybe, although in this case, memory is the result rather than the origination, because once everything vanishes, all we have is left are memories.
So we have this wildness of feeling, and then that opens us up to the memories.
Yeah, almost like memories, maybe almost like memories that we buried or repressed or something. It's interesting. It's interesting that he says that the memories should be out of season, and I wonder, should according to whom? To me, is this some conventional philosophical or societal expectation about what's appropriate to the various, seasons of life? To me, the word should implies a socially constructed code of behavior. And even seasons, we might think of seasons as being natural patterns, but actually different cultures measure seasons in different ways, and the starting point of spring or summer or whatever is imagined differently in different parts of the world. So even seasons are culturally determined descriptions of natural cycles. And so it's almost as though, the socially, or the should of some culturally determined should is falling away here. I should have forgotten about this, but I haven't. And what I haven't forgotten about has something to do with the hot blood of youth.
Mhm.
And so, interestingly, what's happening is in the sky is burning, but becoming icier and icier and icier. But the refinement process that's happening inside the speaker is becoming hotter and hotter and hotter.
That's right.
And so they're kind of both processes of refinement, but they kind of invert each other. And it makes me think of, the line that Yeats was fond of quoting about, when it's winter there, it's summer here. It's
Mhm.
another one of these moments where the heavenly and the earthly seem to be living each other's death or dying each other's life somehow.
It's interesting. It's formally at the sixth line to where we get this and that semicolon. And
Yeah.
that sort of balancing of these two contraries.
Yeah, and it's also at this point in the poem. I think it's a turning point for a couple of reasons. It's usually this point in the poem where I begin to notice the beginning. I'm sort of overwhelmed by the suddenness of the start, but about this point in the poem, I notice that one of the paradoxes here is that the experience that's being described is described with this sudden immediacy. But Yeats is using the past tense.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a really different poem than The Second Coming, which uses the present tense and makes it seem like, oh, this is happening right now. In this case, there's something that happened in the past that's now being remembered and retold by the poet. And that has something to do with a recalibration of the poet's understanding of the relationship between the present and the past. So at this point in the poem is where I kind of feel like there's a little bit of the poet's agency beginning to assert itself.
Mm-hmm.
Once the residue of memory is left, the poet, I don't know, has some control over how that memory is interpreted.
That's interesting. And I think that's right. I mean, when you're reading that poem, that the suddenness of vision and the sort of sense of being overwhelmed is the initial impression, and then starting to recognize the degree to which there is agency in this poem. I think that mirrors, in a way, what you were talking about before with the form, that sense of the whole thing being this kind of torrent of thought and then feel all these different kinds of feelings and memories, etc. And yet there's something organized to it. There's an artifice to it. Yeah. So we get in line 7, and I took all the blame. I took all the blame out of all sense and reason.
Well,
go ahead.
Self-judgment is going to end up being one of the great themes of late Yeats.
All right.
Moments of triumph will be associated with, for example, being able to arrange your life in one clear view, stand in judgment on your own soul, and dismiss it all. I'm thinking obviously of Man in the Echo, or in Dialogue with Self and Soul, following to its source every event in action or thought, and forgiving yourself. So late Yeats is going to get to this point where he claims the authority to stand in judgment on his own soul and forgive himself, at least at moments of maximum intensity. Now, he's not quite doing that here. I mean, he's not there yet because he's blaming himself rather than forgiving himself. But what I find exciting about it is he's also aware that blaming himself to this extent is unreasonable.
Yeah.
So he's beginning to resist that. So you're talking about how this poem is a kind of a precursor. I just feel like this is a kind of nascent early flash of that Yeats's resistance to the idea that he's going to be blamed or judged by the skies. He's beginning to push back against that, although it's a kind of tentative pushback here. It's unreasonable for me to be doing this.
Mhm.
And it's ironic too, because of course, sense and reason are exactly what's been made to vanish by the sudden influx of sight and imagination and memory.
Mhm. Mhm. And it comes right after the poem, it's the poem before it, Friends, right? And a very different sort of attitude toward, in that poem, toward three. I think that poem features the three of the women in his life:
Right.
Olivia Shakespeare, Lady Gregory, and of course Maud Gonne. And this one, I think, pretty clearly occasioned by thoughts about Maud Gonne.
Yeah.
A different kind of attitude. And you're right, taking blame, but recognizing that taking blame is unreasonable, and perhaps overdoing it. Yeah, until I cried and trembled and rocked to and fro, riddled with light. That's always a sort of interesting moment in the poem, right? Like this sense of like having taken on this blame, knowing that perhaps it's being unreasonable to take on all this blame, and then sort of himself before this light that is sort of shooting through him, I guess.
Yeah, well, you mentioned the fact that the poem seems like a kind of premonition of the idea of the dreaming back.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we start in middle age, and then we backtrack to the hot blood of youth, and at this point, we're just pretty much back to infancy.
Mm-hmm.
We're naked, we're riddled with light. There's a notion of some other kind of birth that's going to take place after death when the ghost quickens. Yeah, when I get to that line about riddled with light, I always think about the line from Per Amica Silentia Lunae, the man can embody truth but cannot know it.
Mm-hmm.
Just sort of somehow penetrated or interfused by a kind of light or knowledge that still remains a riddle.
Right, and tying in with that idea that you were talking about before about vision. I mean, this idea of being just in the grip of vision. To what extent is he in control of vision here? And the kind of pun there, I guess, and riddled, right? Like, this kind of question that doesn't have an answer, which sets up the question that doesn't have an answer. Right.
Yeah.
I love the idea of birth, though, too. This movement to infancy. I hadn't thought about that, but it's fascinating, isn't it? That the crying, the trembling, the rocking to and fro, riddled with light, is a way of imagining infancy, right? This being beset by these different sort of sensations and apprehending light, and that works really well, because again, as you're saying, then it sets up this birth into something else after death. This what we're born into after death. The ghost begins to quicken. So the death leading to the ghost emerging here, and confusion of the deathbed over. Assuming that's sort of the final moments of life when we're sort of returned to that kind of infancy. We're sort of riddled with light. We're trembling, rocked to and fro. Perhaps suffused with a kind of this kind of vision, but maybe unaware of what it is, unable to control it. And then the really powerful and I think beautiful final moment. The ghost sent out naked on the road, as the book saying, stricken by the injustice of the skies for punishment. I wonder what you think about. Well, I know you have a lot to say about this, but the word injustice there is one that always is interesting to me, because
I puzzle over that too a little bit. And one of the things I puzzle about is whether injustice here suggests indifference or sort of active, vengeful unfairness.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I guess I kind of lean towards the latter interpretation a little bit. I think, I don't know. One question I'm asking myself is this business about, sent out naked on the roads. I don't know. It's like an evicted tenant. Is this like an eviction metaphor here? I mean, sent out naked on the roads. I mean, that's a really powerful kind of metaphor, in Irish culture, Irish history. That's definitely something that I would associate with unfairness and injustice.
Mhm, mhm,
Somebody being sent out on the roads. That's a victim.
mhm,
So it makes me feel like the speaker is, well, there may be a lot of tones a lot of levels to the tone of voice here, but anger might be one of the tones here. And it's interesting to hear anger because, I think that's an indication that the speaker is not willing to passively accept the judgment of the skies.
mhm,
Um,
mhm.
not willing to accept what the books say.
I was just gonna note that because the books that kind of, as the books say, it reminds me of what you were talking about before with the line that should be out of season, that kind of
Right.
certainty, that's kind of knowledge that's really being subtly undercut here, I think. Um, what about the idea of then vision and agency at the end here? Is the speaker sort of, I mean, the fact that he's sort of able to, eh, as you're saying, maybe um, sort of rail against this injustice does suggest at least some level of agency.
I think it does. I think that's in some ways the drama that I find exciting about the end of the poem.
Mhm.
Um, you know, for Yeats for Yeats to simply be to imagine a cosmos in which we are simply passively judged and made the victims of overwhelming forces outside of ourselves. That's his version of hell. That's something that he's been afraid of forever. As far back as the poems of the, come near, come near, come near, I'll leave me still a little
Yeah.
space for the rose breath to fill. That notion of the overwhelming outside judgment. And so, yeah, the fact that he's expressing anger here, the fact that this is a question, kind of defiant question, I think, the fact that the poem has these two time frames. This isn't just a present tense record of something happening. This is an artfully patterned meditation on something that occurred in a past time frame. Yeah, I don't know. I've taught Yeats seminars before in which a poem like this became a kind of touchstone as we worked forward into some poems like you were mentioning Friends or Man in the Echo or Dialogue of Self and Soul or The Circus Animal's Desertion or
I
all
was,
these other
as you're
poems for
talking, yeah,
Yeats.
yeah. Like I was
And
thinking about the circus animal's desertion, this just reassertion of agency, this continual affirmation of the capacity of the self, to never be rendered completely passive victim. And I think that makes sense. I don't often teach this poem actually, because I think when I'm usually in responsibilities, it's the first couple of poems that I'm always just spending a lot of time on. I think I'm definitely going to come use this one again, because I think you're right. It is such a precursor, and you can see all of these echoes later on. I think the fact that coming right after Friends too is interesting. So at the end of that previous poem, so great a sweetness flows, I shake from head to foot. This is a really different, a different response to his friendships and loves in the past. Yeah. Other things you want to say about the ending?
Well, I mean, I think I've said more or less what I had to say about the poem, and I'd love to keep talking about it.
I think we're there. I think that was really illuminating for me. And I think so much of what you're talking about fits with that initial point about the form. And I'm so glad we talked about this, because it opened up the formal complexity of this poem to me in ways that I had not recognized at all. And I think that formal complexity gets at what's going on at the level of content here, the complexity at the level of content. And I mean, you read this poem at first, and it does feel as if the person overwhelmed, naked on the roads, stricken by the sky, oh my God, purgatorial punishment, passive sort of victim. And instead, yeah, your reading really helped me see the complexity of that and the sort of pushing back. So that's great. I really appreciate it, David. That was a lot of fun.
Thank you. It was great fun.
All right. Thanks for doing this. And I'll talk to you again soon in the future. Take care.
Okay.